Hi, and welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Marie Antoinette. We have come to chapter 32, which is called Paris 1780. And it is when our protagonist, now Cornelius, is returning, this time with Saint Germain, to Paris after his previous troubled embodiment there. So we'll see how that goes. Chapter 32, Paris 1780. It felt strange to return to the city after so many years. I could feel and almost touch the progress of its disease, the loosening of its fibers as decomposition became imminent. The lava that would erupt into the streets was being heated most vigorously by those who danced atop the volcano, the majority of the nobility. For this was the era in which Versailles and the Trianon were virtually two hostile fortresses with a weak-willed king swaying between them like a limp bell clapper. Yet, despite the lampooning poems and scurrilous slanders, the people in general would have been willing to make their peace with Marie Antoinette. In spite of the inflammation of their chronic dissatisfaction, they were still spellbound by the magic of the throne. It was Versailles, deserted and mocked by the careless queen, that howled for vengeance. We got to Paris at the end of October. The Count did not go to court immediately, but remained at home in his own palace. It was tucked away behind the Saint Roch church and sat in its own large park. There was a small building in front that camouflaged it nicely. What you could see through the trees looked grey and insignificant. The same duality was found in the house. It was a true reflection of Saint Germain himself. If one entered through the main gate, he went through a tropical greenhouse filled with exotic vines and flowers, and decorated by artificial lotus pools. Then he came to the splendid halls within. The walls were covered in brocade and damask, and the upholstery, curtains, Venetian mirrors, porcelain fireplaces, carpets, chandeliers, tapestries, and artworks overshadowed Versailles itself. But on the second floor, where Saint Germain really lived, there was no such luxury. His bedroom was like a monk's cell. There was an enthralling painting of Christ over his narrow iron bed. He had painted it himself with those colors that glowed in the dark. The only other ornament was an ivory statue of Buddha that was fully half a meter high and had a green gem in the middle of its forehead. It stood on an ebony pedestal set in a small niche, and a lotus-shaped sanctuary lamp burned in front of it. There were two rooms off this cubicle. One was a well-equipped bathroom and dressing chamber. The other was a small, almost empty room whose windows were covered by a heavy curtain. A rush mat was on the floor, and the walls were hung with large colored prints of 22 hieroglyphs. The only furniture was a long, narrow table which held a large sky globe and two 7-branched candelabra. Both star map and hieroglyphs glowed in the dark, as did the portrait of Christ. The laboratory and library opened from this meditation room. I occupied a section similar to the Count's, and we shared the laboratory and the library. My cell was decorated with a cross. As I came to know Saint Germain, all my doubts and suspicions vanished, and I admired and trusted him absolutely. Every day, we got up at dawn, bathed, and put on long dark robes like monks' cowls. Then we each went into our meditation rooms to perform meditation exercises. In addition to animating hieroglyphs, I also worked on my telepathic ability. At a predetermined time after our basic exercises, Saint Germain would send me telepathic messages from the other wing of the palace, geometrical symbols, letters, and finally whole sentences I had to write down verbatim. During this exercise, I wore an Egyptian headband with a gold serpent in the middle. After these exercises, we would stroll in the park for an hour, then breakfast on porridge and fresh fruits. Generally, we spent the morning working together in the laboratory. After lunch, I read and made notes while Saint Germain worked on his principal book, La Très Sainte Trinosophie, the Most Holy Trinosophy. This book is a work of unparalleled significance. And I've seen the copies I've seen, it's called the Most Holy Trinosophia, the Most Holy Trinosophy here. Anyway, continuing on. This book is a work of unparalleled significance. It is really the diary of a soul's coming of age and may be seen merely as a description of Saint Germain's own initiation and progress in the mystical brotherhood. The purpose of the book is to teach disciples who already know the terminology. The text begins with all the allegorical details of the ceremonies of the classic age, and symbolic language is used throughout. Thus the work seems incomprehensible on initial reading, but deeper analysis will show the hidden significance of each detail. The book is written in 12 parts, and each has a sketch that supplies the explanation of it. The first parts deal with the so-called Memphis ceremony of the Neo-Egyptian tradition, and the tests applied to the aspirant are related to the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Its basic pattern is a powerful one of the 12 houses of the zodiac. 4. The zodiac is the great cycle of the soul, and it was by watching the sun's orbit across its signs that the ancient priesthood developed the idea of the sacred cycle. They believed the first sign was the beginning and the last was the end of all human wisdom. Saint Germain constructed this book of the 3-layered wisdom in alchemical symbols for the most part. What he was really describing, of course, was not the real chemical knowledge, since he, like all other great alchemists, regarded gold making as only a very small part of knowledge. He was writing about the spiritual process of man toward adepthood. During the afternoon, I would take care of the mail and then walk for 2 or 3 hours. I roamed the streets of Paris freely, but felt no desire to return to the scenes of my memories. Still, I remembered my mother's parting injunction and decided not to avoid them. I would settle the matter, thumb through my old thesis, and see if there was indeed a gap in my knowledge. First, I went to the little shop on the Rue Saint-Honoré. It didn't seem to have changed at all. There were the religious relics crowded on the rough wood shelf by the cellar door, just as they had been in Lepitre's time. There was a musty odor about the place which immediately conjured up the image of the ravaged, slovenly Rosalie. It was still a bookshop, just as before. The bell over the door sounded so familiar that my heart skipped a beat. There was a small, ugly girl squatting in the moth-eaten silence, her hollow face lit up as she jumped up to serve me. "Can I help you, monsieur? I light a candle for you. You go right on and browse." I watched her light the candle, lost in my memories. The girl, mistaking my silence for hesitancy, hastened to reassure me. "My father's out for the day, but I can get you anything you wish. Absolutely anything, monsieur." I was sure from her voice that she was offering some of the secret literature so much in demand those days. "Anything?" I prodded. She nodded, disappeared behind a tattered curtain, and returned with a little yellow pamphlet. "The latest," she whispered. I leaned toward the candle and opened the pamphlet. "Chacun se demande tout bas, le roi Ponty, ne pend-il pas la triste reine en désespéré?" I apologize for my French. Continuing on. It was a satirical poem against the queen. As I continued to read, the girl became agitated. "Please, monsieur, someone might come in." To quiet her, I put the dangerous merchandise in my pocket, paid, and bade her farewell. Then I hurried to get home through the darkening streets. Voices rumbled out of the darkness, laughs, snatches of curses, and the sound of running feet filled the air around me. Somewhere, someone was mockingly reciting the banned poem I had just bought, extracting the maximum laughter from the erotic details. That evening at supper, I showed the booklet to Saint Germain and told him how I had acquired it, and later heard it recited in the Paris streets. This is another poison that has overflowed from the palace into the sewers, the Count remarked as he leafed through it. Fools! Don't they realize these attacks on the throne are deliberately undermining the only system that supports their own privileges? They are paying these poets to write their own death warrants. I shuddered at his ominous words. I too had felt this premonition ever since we had come to Paris. They say terrible things about the Queen. You know her. Is she really as bad as all that? Cornelius, she is no better and no worse than the others. She just doesn't pretend. She isn't really evil, just extravagant, a curious, hedonistic and superficial woman with all the amiable characteristics of a self-assured child. But this child doesn't realize she's playing with explosives. Maybe you could warn her? I ventured. I haven't even tried. Words bore her if they're not the most transparent rococo lace. Her soul has all the depth of the ornamental pool at the Trianon. Fate always chooses the best tool to fulfill itself. It will take searing events to change Marie Antoinette and burn the dross from her, but you'll soon meet her for yourself, Cornelius. Really? How's that? Oh, she will need me, Saint Germain replied evasively. That was chapter 32, and we'll go right into chapter 33, which is called the Bloody Crystal. I decided to make a pilgrimage to my old home. All that stood on the site was a small shack. The garden was overgrown with weeds, and only the stumps of the fence were left. What in the world had happened, I wondered. Time hadn't done all that in just a few decades. As I approached, an old beggar crawled out of the shack and studied me suspiciously. I decided to ask him to explain the mystery. There was a brick palace here some years ago, I began. Maybe there was, he replied tersely. Who owns this property now? Now he became positively hostile. It's not for sale. Belongs to the city. With that, he crawled back into his hovel. Curious, I started making inquiries at nearby houses and shops. Finally, an old woman told me the house had burned down in 1750. A fire had started in a locked room, and they could not find the key in time. A fitting fate for a house whose occupants had been destroyed by inner fires. The Marquise d'Anjou's palace, where the Lambs had met, was still unchanged. It had changed owners during the time of the spendthrift Corinna. She had been the sole heir of the d'Anjou fortune, for her sickly brother Christian had died young, but palace, jewels, and all had disappeared under the ministrations of Germain and Martin Allais. The palace became the property of the Polignac family in 1780, and a distant member of the clan now occupied it. Saint Germain's name would have gotten me in, of course, but I had no desire to revisit those pompous old rooms. The only person I felt any nostalgia for was the kindly Dr. Pelloc. Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria and mother of the French Queen, died without seeing the birth of a dauphin, an event for which she had longed. She had hoped that production of an heir would solidify her daughter's position and bring her emotional maturity. Now Marie Antoinette was completely alone. The Empress's ambassador, Mercy, no longer had any influence with her now that his mistress was dead. The death of her mother terrified the thoughtless Marie Antoinette. Maria Theresa had scolded her like a naughty child, but she had cared for her, even though it was from a distance. Now the queen felt she had lost her only rear guard, the only person she could count on to support her against the world and even against herself. She found herself surrounded by selfish, frivolous friends, a weak and indifferent husband, and a world that watched her with suspicion. She was overcome with anxiety, and her only true friend, the little Lamballe, could only weep with her. Her other confidant, the Countess Polignac, was ill and could not come to court. Dark premonitions tormented her. One evening in early December, I returned from my evening walk to find our lower halls brilliantly lit. Deducing that we had company of high rank, I circled the house and went up to my room the back way. Here, Yidam was waiting for me with a message. I was to don full evening dress in honor of our exalted guest, the Queen of France. I was both curious and self-conscious as I made my way into the salon. I found two young women in deep mourning, the Princess de Lamballe and the troubled Marie Antoinette, whose eyes were red with weeping. The Queen received my introduction informally, almost absent-mindedly, and impatiently told Saint Germain to begin his experiment. The Count led his guests into the ornate study we never used for that purpose. A crystal ball stood on the desk, glittering in the light of the multitudinous candles. Obeying Saint Germain's mute command, I extinguished all save the ones at either end of his desk. After seating the women in comfortable chairs, he sat down before the ball. I lit the censer, and soon a soothing, comforting fragrance filled the room. The Princess de Lamballe uneasily moved closer to the Queen and glanced fearfully at the Count, who was absorbed in the crystal ball. Soon she also was mesmerized by the sparkling crystal. During this hypnotic silence, I stealthily watched this woman who was the most envied and hated person in all France. Marie Antoinette stared motionlessly in front of her, a mask of sorrow. Her regular, delicate features could not compete with the childlike beauty of her companion, but a certain vibrant restlessness made her the more striking. Even now, she exuded willful, haughty impatience, and those sensitive, sensuous lips revealed great potential for rash words, irrevocable insults, and irretrievable silences. The curve of her nostrils mirrored her insatiable demand for new and different entertainments, and her total disregard for everyone else in the world. There was no depth to those clear, flashing eyes. She looked to the external world for her light. Just now, her sorrow had unleashed forgotten perceptions from the death chamber of dormant abilities where both her past and her future awaited her. Having deciphered this hieroglyph, I turned my attention to the ball. It was already clouded, coming to life. A whitish mist swirled with darker patches in the midst of it, just like the mute, crowded jostling of astral matter. Slowly, the delicate face of the little Lamballe emerged through the murk, but it was the face of a dead woman. The mist about her began to glow blood red, and parts of her naked body floated to the surface as if spewed up by an ocean of blood. The flesh of those begrimed limbs was decayed and corpse-like. I was aroused by a scream. The Princess de Lamballe was screaming wildly, her cries interspersed with gasps of horror. She pressed her hands to her eyes and gabbled hysterically. "Sweet Jesus, help me! Let me get away! I can't bear it! I won't look any more! Lead us not into temptation! It's too horrible!" The Queen quickly knelt before her, stroking and comforting her. Saint Germain mixed a tranquilizer in a glass of wine and forced it between her trembling lips. Finally, she became somewhat calmer, but refused to tell the Queen what it was that had frightened her. "It was nothing to do with your Majesty, just me. I kill myself here and now if you commanded it, but I can't tell what I saw in that crystal. Please don't be angry. Don't ask me to do it. I can't even bear to think about it. It is too horrible." Her lips began to tremble again, and she broke into quiet sobs. The queen, pitying her, did not ask any further, but turned to Saint Germain. "Well, can't you say something consoling?" She spoke with the reproach of a spoiled child. "The near future is like a sunset, Your Majesty. It shows a dark night coming upon us. But if you are satisfied with the light of a few years, well, what is it?" Marie Antoinette's voice snapped with fear and tension. "1 year from today," Saint Germain replied, "the Dauphin will be born." A small sigh arose from the queen's lips, and the joyous smile of the mother spread over her face. "The Dauphin? My Lord and God, if only it were true!" "It is already a fact, Your Majesty. This part of the future awaits us like a refuge, let's say in Varennes. We have only to travel there on the carriage of time." The queen positively glowed at the thought. "You don't know, you can't possibly know how much that would mean to me, how many of my problems it would solve." Saint Germain replied, "It will solve many problems, Your Majesty, but it won't silence those you expect it to. They will become even louder, for the birth of the Dauphin will thwart many plans." Then I could care less about them." This careless comment epitomized the queen's attitude up until the tragedy struck. "What can they do to me if I produce a legitimate heir to the throne?" "I have a humble request of Your Majesty." Saint Germain spoke quietly. "But what, Magister?" Marie Antoinette spoke jestingly, all attention and generosity. "You know I take care of my friends." "If the heir is born, as I said, will you give some thought to some advice I add to my prophecy?" "Speak, Saint Germain. Tonight I will even listen to advice." "Will you follow it if the crown prince is born?" "Well, maybe, assuming you don't advise something contrary to my nature or something that would bore or humiliate me." "Maybe I didn't use the right word, Your Majesty." Saint Germain's face was grave. "This is not advice. It is a warning. It may well bore and humiliate Your Majesty in your present mood. What I ask is that you make a short trip to Versailles after the Dauphin is born. Build a bridge between yourself and the nobility and another between yourself and the people. This would resolve and rescue everything." "I will have to think about that," the queen replied, leaning back in her chair. "First, let us see the prophecy fulfilled." Suddenly she made a mischievous face. "Have you ever met the king's sisters, Count Saint Germain, or that old tombstone Madame de Noailles? I can't even think about them without yawning or laughing. They just want to take out their aborted lives on me. I believe they would send me to the stake if they could take my youth and the few free moments I snatch by doing so. I wish I knew why they get so mad because I want to breathe fresh air and enjoy myself like any other simple Frenchwoman." "Unfortunately, Your Majesty was not born a simple Frenchwoman. You sit upon the French throne at a critical period. Your country is threatened with danger both within and without. Its throne must be a living, fighting symbol. It must fight the greatest battle in history for the trust and love of its people. Your Majesty must give birth not only to a Dauphin, but to a fuller idea of the kingdom, an idea that can survive the dangerous currents that have been building up since the time of the Sun King." Saint Germain's voice took on a more urgent, persuasive note. "Your Majesty is bold enough to take a stand against old prejudices, make war on the traditions of Versailles, and scorn the hate of the nobility, just to gain a little freedom and light-hearted pleasure. Won't you do the same thing just once for the good of the people? Try to understand and remedy their ills. Acknowledge that they are in an untenable situation. Thus, you can make an alliance with them. No one on earth can fight two enemies at once with any hope of success. You have to align yourself with one or the other to survive. You do not wish to ally yourself with the past. Make an alliance with the future. Let there be a bloodless revolution of long-awaited reforms. These things will eventually come to pass with or without your majesty. The queen listened to Saint Germain's quiet voice with growing discomfort, and gradually her face hardened into rigid rejection. I prefer not to understand what you have just told me, Count Saint Germain, she said coldly. If I had chosen to understand it, I would have called it a threat rather than a warning. The kingdom, thank God, is still strong enough to put rebels in their proper place. It is the king's province to govern and handle the problems of the people. I never interfere in that area. His Majesty certainly does everything he can. No outsider can judge a leader truly. And you are greatly mistaken if you believe my personal quarrels and the petty intrigues against me mean I am rebelling against our past traditions. I believe unreservedly in the God-given power of the king and in the ancient unshakable superiority of the throne. After all, good times and bad come to everybody. The people become discontented from time to time and sing rude satirical songs, but they always rally around the throne when crisis comes to the nation. I am not afraid of my people, and I do not find it necessary to make alliances with them, for I am their queen. And the hostility among some of the nobility is just the bitterness of a neglected lover. They know that any revenge they might take would shake the throne and destroy themselves. No, the nobility can never endanger the queen. She spoke with proud stubbornness, drawn up to her full height as though the armchair were her throne. Poor blind woman, she was both pitiful and majestic at that moment. Abruptly, she leaned back as though exhausted. You are mistaken, my lord. You are merely exaggerating trifles. I hope your prophecy is more accurate. Well, we will soon know, your majesty. Saint Germain responded equably, I have only a year to prove it. After the women had left, I told Saint Germain the horror I had seen in the crystal. He nodded. The crystal was swimming in blood, Cornelius. It showed the future so clearly that even the frightened, childish Princess de Lamballe saw it. That's why she was so upset. Poor little princess, what an end. And that was the end of chapter 33. Next time, chapter 34 is called the Trianon. Not the QAnon, the Trianon.